Okay, welcome to our first colloquium of the spring. We've been shut out a couple of times because of snow days, but we got it in today. I'm really pleased to introduce the speaker today. It's Dr. Julius Fridriksson from the University of South Carolina. He's a graduate of the University of Arizona, where he worked with Audrey Holland. Some of you students are familiar with that name. Well, you should be. You will be. He's been at the University of South Carolina, Columbia for over 17 years in the Department of Communication Sciences and Disorders. He currently holds the title of Smart State Endowed Professor. He's also the co-director of the McCausland Center for Brain Imaging and director of CSTAR, the Center for the Study of Aphasia Recovery. This center is a collaboration between University of South Carolina, Medical University of South Carolina, Johns Hopkins University, and University of California at Irvine. Was recently funded by NIH for over $11 million. For those of you who are graduate student clinicians, we invited Dr. Fridriksson to present today because he's an excellent example of an individual who conducts applied clinical research. His talk today is going to be on electrical brain stimulation and aphasia treatment outcomes. Please welcome Dr. Fridriksson.
Thank you, Carl. I want to start by saying thank you to Dr. Coelho and the rest of the faculty who've been very inviting and taking time to chat with me this morning. I'm very glad to see that I made it in at exactly the right time after the big snowstorm and before the next big snowstorm, because I'll be leaving this afternoon for sunny South Carolina. So I'm going to talk about brain stimulation today. I'm going to start by just getting really into the basics and then talk about some applied studies that we've been using. I think that this is a technology that for us as speech-language pathologists, that's what I am. In the future, if the research goes where we think it is, I think this is something that for you as clinicians, you probably are going to want to know this. Because I suspect that if the research is, that now I think is promising, if this gets translated into clinical practice, this is definitely something that will come across your desk in the future. So, a little bit on the outline here. So I'm going to talk specifically about electrical brain stimulation to enhance aphasia treatment outcome. What I'm going to focus on is one of the brain stimulation techniques, the transcranial direct current stimulation. I'm going to talk about the basics. So what is this? And then the mechanisms. What do we think this does to the brain? And then I'm going to talk about what the research is that has been done in normal populations, clinical populations, and then focus probably 90% of my talk on aphasia, because that's what I study every day. So I actually came across this picture a few years ago. This is early brain stimulation. It looks pretty scary to me. This is an electrical current generator right here. This was done to treat psychiatric patients, from what I can tell, back in the early 1900s. It looks pretty scary right now. It's very different than what we do right now, but this was done to deliver what we would call electroshock therapy. So passing electricity through the brain in order to try to treat it is certainly not something that is new. So when you talk about electrical brain stimulation, people typically talk about three different methods. Going from left to right there, if we consider this sort of like a continuum, we know deep brain stimulation, which is typically used for treating Parkinson's. It's also been used for other movement disorders and things like pain. Then transcranial magnetic stimulation, that's a different mechanism that actually, you put a wand on the scalp. When it sets off for about a split second, it actually causes neurons underneath to fire. So you can literally put this on your motor cortex, and you can see your hand move as a result of it. And then transcranial direct current stimulation, which is what I'm going to talk about. It's a far less potent approach, but one that we think has some promise in rehabilitation. If we go from left to right, we get much more decreased cost going from deep brain stimulation over to TDCS, much less risk. TDCS is has very low adverse effects, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. But we also have the flip side here. There's increased efficacy and specificity going from TDCS over to deep brain stimulation. You can see the effects of deep brain stimulation pretty much immediately after the electrodes have been placed. The things that are nice about TDCS that I think make it something that might be used in clinical practice is that it's deployable. The mechanism itself is very small, it's very compact. You need minimal supervision, and so far the major adverse effects have been itching on the scalp and some redness on the scalp. It's designated by the FDA as a not significant risk device. So a little bit about how we think this works. So this is a very simple setup. You basically have two electrodes, you put them on the scalp, starting right here. So this is the left and this is the right. And then what you do is that you pass a current between the anode electrode over to the cathode electrode. Actually, I think I have this a little bit animated right here. Yeah, so the current flows across the cortex and it goes inwards under the anode electrode and outwards under the cathode. You can think about this simply as taking two electrodes from a battery, putting them on the scalp, and you pass a current between the two. It's really simple and straightforward. As a matter of fact, the mechanism, the hardware, is literally driven by a 9-volt battery. So typically, the current that we use is 1 to 2 milliamps. So this is very low voltage. Let me see. So if we think about, if this is the head surface right here, do we have a pointer? All right, let me see. Does this show? Yeah. So I can just do it this way. So if we think about this as the electrode on the scalp, so this is the head surface right here. Once you turn on the anode electrode, so under the anode electrode, we have current flow that goes then into the brain. And what that is thought to do is to increase excitability and increase brain plasticity. That's because of what is hyperpolarization of the cell compartments that is distal from the anode electrode. The opposite happens for the cathode electrode, where the current flows out. It's thought to have the opposite effect, so that under the cathode electrode we get decreased excitability and decreased plasticity. Now, this really all starts, so TDCS really started with this study back in 2000. So it seems to me that it was a short while ago. Awesome. Well, you know what? I actually don't have this.
Oh, this is new technology.
But does your laser pointer work?
Yeah.
That's perfect. That's perfect. Awesome. Thank you so much. Awesome. Yeah, so it seems now it's actually quite a while ago, but this study was published in the Journal of Physiology back in 2000. After this, TDCS research really takes off. So in the first few years following the publication of this paper, you would see somewhere between 10 and 15 papers per year, probably till about 2004, 2005. I think if you look at just the published literature last year, we're talking several thousand papers that were published using TDCS for many different reasons. So I'm going to talk briefly about what this study showed, because it was a very important study. And what they wanted to look at was the effect of TDCS on motor evoked potentials, or MEPs, under both anodal and cathodal electrodes over the motor cortex. So what these researchers wanted to do was that they wanted to look at changes in the motor evoked potential in exactly this muscle right here, the one that you use to move your little pinky like this. And what they would do is that they would do TDCS over the motor cortex over an extended period of time, about 5 minutes, and then they would simply take it away and then do TMS and over the motor cortex, trying to get this muscle to fire. And I'm going to show you in a little bit why they were able then to show what the effect this has on excitability and inhibition of neural firing. So the electrode placement, they put the active electrode, if you will, directly over the motor cortex, so you can think about this like here. This is a huge electrode, if you will. The electrode really is nothing but a saline-soaked sponge. And then you hook that up to the actual wire. The reference electrode was over the orbital frontal lobe, so that would be the reference electrode right here. They did the TDCS for 5 minutes, and then they did TMS before and after TDCS. Now think about this. If you're measuring the motor evoked potential from this muscle, if the TDCS has any effect, you should see an increase after the anodal condition, because that's excitatory, and you should see a decrease in the motor evoked potential if in the case of the cathode electrode, which is supposed to be inhibitory. Now that's exactly what they showed, so I'm going to explain the results right here. This is baseline. If there is no effect at all, then the motor evoked potential should be right here. But what they found is that under the anodal electrode, the motor evoked potential was increased at 1 minute, at 2 minutes, 3 minutes, and then it gradually goes down. And then it goes down to baseline here, which is about 10 minutes after the stimulation itself. But interestingly enough, the opposite happens for motor evoked potentials under the cathode electrode. You see an inhibition, and it actually then goes back to baseline gradually over time. It was really this simple, but what I would call a very elegant study that suggested that there is something here that is having a modulatory effect on the brain. And really all the studies since really flow from this. This has been replicated in other studies. A lot of research happening now, but really because of this one breakthrough. Now, a lot of TDCS studies have been done. Most of them are in normal subjects, which is not terribly interesting to us as SLPs, but anodal TDCS has been suggested to, I would say rather than proven to, it has been suggested to boost long-term memory, improve attention, improve working memory, enhance learning of many different kinds, for example, motor processing, vocabulary, and arithmetic. I think what is very much needed, however, is a replication of some of these studies. There is a lot of hype around this mechanism, and so what I think is needed is much greater emphasis on replication, but that's unfortunately pretty much anywhere in science. With regards to TDCS in clinical populations, there's also been a lot of attention with different clinical populations. What we have seen so far is studies on depression, MS, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's disease, migraine headache, drug abuse, tinnitus. Oh, and my daughters, last summer when I made this slide, they really liked that song. My teenage daughters, they're trying to be nuts. I put that in there. I wish I could do TDCS on them. They're 14 and 15. They caught on very quickly, and so they kept playing it, and it's terrible. With regards to stroke, there is quite a bit of studies that have been done with motor recovery, so trying to couple it with physical therapy and occupational therapy, and certainly people have looked at the effects of TDCS on language and communication recovery. Most of these studies have been very small sample size or single case studies. But I would say that so far, many of those studies look very promising. If we move to TDCS on treating aphasia, well, why would we want to do this? Well, there are some neuroimaging studies that suggest that changes in brain activation, certainly in some cases increase in activation, is associated with improved language processing, both spontaneous and treated recovery. And what we thought, while TDCS can be used to modulate, either excite or inhibit brain activation, therefore, perhaps TDCS can be used to enhance, encourage, boost, change, whatever you want to call it, brain activation, and therefore improve language processing. This was really the simple idea behind the reason why we got into this. We think that this may work during aphasia therapy. There is some research that has been done on applying TDCS in the absence of aphasia therapy. That hasn't shown very fruitful results so far. But I would say that the studies, almost all the studies that we've seen so far, was when somebody was receiving aphasia therapy and getting TDCS at the same time. We can talk about that later if you're interested in why that might be the case, that only works during therapy. And by the way, if I am talking about something that doesn't make sense, if you want to ask a question during the talk, that's totally fine. Just raise your hand and I'll be happy to answer. So we have been doing this now for over 10 years. We started our first study back in 2008. And one of the persons that is really behind TMS work, Mark George, who is a professor at the Medical University of South Carolina, has done a lot of work with brain stimulation. He's one of the editors of the journal Brain Stimulation. He actually introduced me to TDCS because I told him we wanted to do TMS in aphasia therapy, but I did not think that was ever going to become a viable option for treating patients. It's very cumbersome, it costs a lot, and it's very painful. And so those studies were just starting to come out in clinical populations with TDCS, and he was the person that actually turned me on to this. So we started the first study with a very simple question. Does brain stimulation improve aphasia treatment outcome? And by brain stimulation, I mean very low current electrical brain stimulation. That's a picture of Frank, one of the postdocs in my lab. And this essentially shows the setup for TDCS that we use. You can see why it's very simple and straightforward to set up. This is actually the generator of the current right here. We have two electrodes. One is on his shoulder, and the other one is on his scalp right here, his left scalp. And all we do is induce a current between the two electrodes to achieve TDCS. We want to know whether TDCS actually improves the outcome of the aphasia therapy. We're not saying that this is going to replace therapy, but rather that's something that is going to give aphasia therapy some boost. In this first study, there were 10 participants. They all had chronic aphasia, because it's much easier to do those studies in chronic patients rather than acute or subacute, because the baseline is much more stable. There were various aphasia types and severities. The treatment was very simple and only lasted for 2 weeks. There were 5 sessions per week, and the session length was only 20 minutes. We selected 20 minutes because at that time, TDCS had not been proven to be safe beyond 20 minutes. So we had that kind of a limitation on us. We used what is called visual speech perception to treat anomia. That's a treatment approach that we published many years ago in the journal Stroke. I'll go into that in my next slide, what that treatment is about. This is a computerized treatment of picture naming, if you will, or lexical retrieval. And it's really simple and straightforward. I will say, this is not the type of treatment that I would suggest you are using in your therapy as SLPs. We use this approach simply because it enabled us to very clearly control for the amount of treatment and type of treatment across the 2 treatment conditions. Okay? So this is not something that you are going to go out as once you are done with your master's, you're going to start applying this in your clinical practice. The setup is very simple. The person has a laptop computer, they hook up to it headphones, so they're watching the computer screen and listening on the headphones, and the treatment goes like this. What they see is a picture, and then they hear and see the mouth of the speaker say a word, and they simply have to press a green button if they're the same, and a red button if they're different. They get feedback immediately, and therefore then they go on to the next item. So it's really simple, working on lexical retrieval. You'll be amazed how much better people get at picture naming with something that is so simple, but they would do this for 20 minutes. This includes the basic elements of aphasia therapy. It includes stimulus, response, and contingency. But again, this is not what you're going to be applying in your clinical practice in the future. The TDCS itself, this was a double-blinded crossover study. Everybody got both conditions. So Some people got 1 week of anodal stimulation with the aphasia therapy, and then they would cross over and get the placebo or sham TDCS in the following week. The outcome measures were trained items, so items that were included in the treatment paradigm, and we also looked at generalization, so just items that people were administered to name, but that were not included in the treatment paradigm itself. The electrode placement, we put the anode electrode on the left frontal lobe and the cathode electrode over the right shoulder, and this was targeted with fMRI, and that's probably, I don't know if that's an overkill or not, but we simply had every one of those participants in an MRI scanner. We looked at where in the frontal lobe do we see brain activation associated with picture naming, and we put the electrode over that area. The most important part about the MRI that we did is that we avoided putting the electrode over the lesion. So if you look at the brain of a stroke patient, what do you actually see in the lesion? What is in there in a chronic patient? Cerebrospinal fluid, right? It just gets filled up with cerebrospinal fluid, and therefore, if you put the electrode directly over the lesion, it's like putting it into a glass of water. The current dissipates. So what you want to do is that you want to try to make sure that you're actually putting it over cortex. And that was one of the reasons why we thought the MRI was very important. The other thing that I forgot to mention is that the current that we induce between the two electrodes is very low. It's only 1 milliamp. So it causes very minimal irritation of the skin. The sham condition or the placebo is the same thing, except that we keep the current on for 20 minutes during the anodal condition. During the sham condition, we turn the current on for about 30 seconds and then we gradually turn it off. The reason why we do that is because initially when you turn on TDCS, you can definitely feel tingling on your scalp. So when you do that in the placebo condition, you actually feel the same sensation. So the only difference between the two conditions, TDCS for 20 minutes versus TDCS for about 30 seconds.
Do you ever exclude people because the lesion is too large on the left, or do you then
No.
on the right?
No, that's a great question. So the reason why we haven't excluded anybody, because we've always had some inclusion and exclusion criteria that have excluded people with very severe aphasia. So if you have global aphasia, you typically do not pass the threshold for inclusion, and therefore, sort of like up front, we already got those people out of the study.
Still have a pretty extensive lesion, though, even with a moderate aphasia.
Yeah, but not so. What I find is that those people with these whopping left hemisphere lesions, I mean, R.G. Hillis has shown me 2 cases where they were pretty good, but I can tell you what, 99% of those patients are extremely severe. So,
Okay, just hasn't happened.
no, it hasn't happened so far. All right, so here are the results. What I want to say is that those studies that I'm going to talk about initially are just pilot studies for the actual big study that we will get to towards the end. The results of this initial study was comparing baseline to T1, which is naming performance on the day after treatment is over. So what we found was that there was a much better response during the anodal TDCS compared to the sham at time 1, which was immediately post-treatment, and T2 was at 1 week post-treatment, and there was also this effect remained, and it was barely statistically significant. For untrained items, so for generalization, it actually did not reach statistically significant difference. Even though the difference seems to be much bigger here, it's because the standard deviations, we would have to increase the size probably double to get the error bars in here. So there was a lot of variance here that causes these p-value actually to be a little bit higher. So far, I have to say when we started getting into this, I was very skeptical. This was actually the dissertation of Julie Baker, who was one of my PhD students. But I would have to say we thought, following this initial study, there seems to be something going on here. So anodal TDCS of the left frontal lobe improves naming in some patients. So I would say that treatment response varied widely. In 5 participants, we had better response with anodal TDCS compared to sham. 4, it was about the same. And in 1 person, there was absolutely no response in either condition. So the effect that you saw before really was driven by 5 people rather than the whole group. Now, you might say, well, that's not great. But if you look at most clinical trials in, well, I shouldn't say most, the most recent clinical trial in aphasia, which was published last year by Breitenstein et al., about 40% of all their participants showed no response. So even though it's a statistically significant effect that they're seeing, a lot of the patients that were included simply did not respond. And guess what? It's going to be the case for you too when you start working as an SLP. I'm going to talk about a little bit later why it's important to understand what are the factors that predict outcome that will then help you make decisions about who is a good candidate and who is not. So we thought, okay, this is a good start, but we wanted to do another follow-up study to get a little bit better handle on this. So we did a follow-up study that I think was much better controlled. This would include actually fewer participants, but what we did now is that we included patients with very similar lesion locations, mostly in the temporal lobe, so posterior damage. One of them had conduction aphasia, but was really on the border of being diagnosed as having anomic aphasia. The aphasia treatment in TDCS, we used the same picture word matching task as before as our treatment. Instead of looking at changes in correct naming, we looked at changes in reaction time because we thought that's probably going to be a much better, much more sensitive outcome measure than simply looking at correct or incorrect naming on a naming task. Like before, we had 5 sessions of anodal TDCS, 5 sessions of sham, and again, the electrode placement was fMRI guided. What we did different than before is that more evidence was emerging, suggesting that the areas that are really important for recovery in aphasia are these residual posterior language areas. So we actually put the anodal electrode over the posterior temporal lobe, at least what was preserved of it. The treatment type here was blinded, and I didn't mention that before in the other study. The participants did not know what condition they were getting. The clinicians who administered the treatment did not know what the condition was. They simply had the TDCS setup, was hooked up to a computer. They pressed a button on the computer and it started the TDCS. We knew what the condition was. The clinicians did not. And the clinicians who scored the outcome tests, they were also blinded to the results. We taped all the outcomes, and then we had the clinicians score them offline. We randomized the order of the videos. They did not know who was getting what when. And then we looked at the reaction time. We had another postdoc in my lab who then looked for correct items, the reaction time on those items, and compared them between the 2 conditions. So here are the results. What we found was that there was a statistically significant difference between the reduction in reaction time immediately post-testing. So that was, let's say somebody finished on a Friday with their treatment. We tested them on Saturday and Sunday, and we simply looked at how much did their reaction time on correct items, how much did it decrease between anodal and sham TDCS. And we found greater reduction in the anodal condition compared to the sham. And we also tested everybody at 3 weeks post, and that was also statistically significant at that time. We got greater reduction in following the anodal stimulation compared to the sham condition. And this was counterbalanced, so that some people did the anodal first, then went over to do the sham, and vice versa. So a little bit of a discussion on this. So TDCS seems to enhance the effect of behavioral aphasia therapy, and there have been several studies since. We came out with that second study back in 2011 that very much support this hypothesis. This paper here by Marcus Meinzer et al. In Brain, several other ones that suggest, you know what, there might be an effect here. And so, the limitations, however, are that, like so many things that in our field, so in communication sciences and disorders, we, in our treatment studies, tend to have very small sample sizes. And that's a problem. The larger the sample size, given that everything else is equal, the larger the sample size, the more reliable your outcome. Many of these studies have not done randomization, and some of them have actually not included blinded outcome testing. So there is an effect called the Rosenthal effect that suggests that if you score your own outcomes, even if you're trying your absolutely best to make sure that you're not biased, people tend to be biased in favor of their hypothesis. So I think it's very important that you blind the outcome raters. So this led us to our big trial that we just finished. This was a trial which was directly on what we were talking about before, TDCS to enhance aphasia treatment outcome, a phase 2 trial, and the study question here was for individuals with chronic post-stroke aphasia undergoing aphasia therapy, does anodal TDCS enhance outcome? So this is a much larger study than what we have talked about before. This was a randomized controlled trial. All participants received aphasia treatment for 3 weeks, so 5 sessions per week. They were randomized to either receiving anodal or sham TDCS. We did not know who was randomized to what conditions. The clinicians did not know. Pretty much nobody knew what the randomization was, except for the people that did the data coordination for our trial. And I'll talk about a little bit about what that involved. This was double-blinded. The participants did not know what they were getting. The SLPs did not know what they were getting. So we tried to blind it just like before, and the outcome was then blinded as well. This is the actual study design. Here's the patient pool, stroke, chronic aphasia. People were randomized to either receive the active TDCS or anodal TDCS or sham TDCS. The primary study phase was 3 weeks. And then we tested them again at 1 week, 6 weeks, and 6 months following the treatment completion. We tested naming ability both of trained and untrained items immediately before and immediately after, as well as each one of these time points. Everybody was tested twice on every test before and after the treatment phase. Now here's the enrollment table. We screened 89 potential participants. We excluded 15 that were not eligible for several different reasons. We did not take repeated stroke, which a lot of your patients, if you work in the hospital or subacute setting, many of your patients who have aphasia or dysphagia as a result of stroke have had multiple strokes. We excluded those people just because we wanted to have a better controlled sample, if you will. We also excluded people with very severe aphasia. We also included folks who were very high. If you scored beyond a certain level on the Philadelphia naming test, we excluded you simply because we wanted to make sure that there would be enough improvement before you would get to a ceiling. So randomization controlled for aphasia type and aphasia severity. 34 people were allocated to the anodal TDCS. 40 were allocated to the sham. The reason why these are unequal is because the algorithm is constantly trying to make sure that your samples are equal on several different factors. That's why we did not end up with them exactly the same size. 33 people here ended up getting 15 treatment sessions. There was one gentleman that opted out, I think after 6 sessions, something like that. Another person over here actually did not opt out, had a seizure after several treatment sessions and was then therefore discontinued in the sham TDCS study. And I'll talk about the adverse events in a little bit. And then lost to follow-up were 3 here, 0 here. And so in our primary analysis, which was 1 week post-therapy, we compared 34 to 40. It was a little bit fewer people at 4 weeks and 6 months, just because we had people that simply did not want to come for the post-treatment assessment. But for all the participants that we enrolled, we're talking about several hundred treatment sessions, several hundred assessment sessions. So it took a long time to do this. One of the reasons why I think this worked out really well is because we hooked up with this center at the Medical University of South Carolina called the Data Coordination Unit. And they are the National Data Coordination Center for StrokeNet. StrokeNet is the largest clinical trial network in the country for stroke. It's funded by the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke, and they are very used to running clinical trials. All the data that our SLPs collected, from the assessments to the treatment, everything was simply entered in on a website, and then whatever you would enter into that website would then populate your database. The other thing that was very important is that all the statistical analyses that were done for the outcome measures, they were all done by these people. So instead of me starting, doing analyses at the end on the outcome data, there was no such thing. They would simply call us and tell us, okay, we have the primary result. They would reveal that and then send us an email with the results themselves. So there was no touching of the outcome by us. Yeah, it was pretty heart-wrenching when gut-wrenching when I got the first phone call. Here's a little bit about the participants. Inclusion criteria: single event ischemic stroke. They got to be at least 6 months post-stroke because we wanted them to be at least somewhat stable. We had some age ranges, several different things. Certainly no MRI contraindications. Some people get excluded based on that, because if you have something like a pacemaker, you cannot be scanned. And oh yeah, we also they had to receive at least 65% accuracy on a screening version of the aphasia treatment task. We wanted to make sure when the people started the treatment, they at least understood what the treatment task was about. And I cannot remember a single person that was actually excluded based on this, but that was one of the criteria they included. Exclusion criteria: history of brain surgery, seizures during the previous 12 months. We have no idea whether TDCS causes seizures, but after thousands and thousands of sessions, there doesn't seem to be any indication that it has an effect on seizure activity. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means for stroke. Greater than 80% naming on the Philadelphia naming test. The Philadelphia naming test was one of our outcome measures, and that's again because we wanted to have some room for recovery. And if you were unable to overtly name at least 5 out of the 80 items included on the pre-treatment fMRI session, that's why some of those really severe people could not be included. The anodal TDCS, we used this is the name of the stimulation device, 1 milliamp of anodal stimulation. The anodal electrode was placed on the left scalp over a targeted cortical region. I'll show you in a little bit where most of those electrodes were placed. The cathode electrode was placed on the contralateral supraorbital frontal scalp region. It's basically just right here. Okay? And then we induce a current between the two. Here are some of the fMRIs that show you where we had the greatest brain activation just in a couple of subjects, and then we simply put the electrode right here trying to target that region, but making sure that we're not putting it directly over the lesion itself, sort of like right here. Go for it.
Why did you change from shoulder to scalp?
Because what we noticed with the shoulder is that a lot of time we were not getting an induction of the current as easily. And when we first started this, there wasn't that much history on, so that was back in 2008. The studies that we had seen, it seemed to be safest to put it on the shoulder, but I think that since then most people have targeted the right frontal. So, let me see. The anodal TDCS stimulation was started at the beginning of the behavioral treatment session and remained active for the first 20 minutes. However, we wanted to simulate something that was closer to what you and I would do in a typical treatment session. So we made the treatment session longer. We made it 45 minutes. We wanted to make it more potent, and we also wanted to try to simulate what you and I would be doing as far as time when we treat patients with aphasia, either in, let's say, outpatient therapy or home health. Here's just a diagram that shows the target locations for the different patients. So each one is the red and the blue balls. This is for the anodal, and this is for the cathode. And what you see is just a random location, but it's all posterior. This is based on the fMRI task, simply looking at the place where we saw the greatest activation in every one of those subjects. The SLP would see a diagram, basically a picture of the scalp, and then they would put the electrode based on the scalp based on that picture. We also used what is called a spatial guiding system that would show them exactly what coordinate they were on in space. So we wanted to make sure that we would control across the subjects the exact location that the electrode was being placed on. The outcome factors, the primary endpoint was change in correct naming at 1 week post-treatment. We looked at two things. We looked at change in correct naming for the trained items, and from now on I'm going to call that naming 80, because I've become so used to calling it that. We called it, those were 80 items that were included in the actual computer program. And we also had untrained items. This is a test called the Philadelphia naming test. This is not typically used in clinical practice, but it's an in-depth test of naming that is mostly used for research purposes. It's a long test. We looked at pre to post-treatment change, computed as the difference between the average of 2 pre-treatment sessions and the average of 2 post-treatment sessions. And we simply subtracted one from the other to see what the change in naming was, only looking at correct items. We also had secondary endpoints. That's just testing at 4 weeks after treatment was over and 6 months. The naming accuracy was scored based on the Philadelphia naming scoring guidelines, and we also had the clinicians at the end of every week, we had the SOPs and the patients guess what condition they thought they were in. So we would ask them, do you think you're getting the real brain stimulation, or do you think you're getting the placebo? And then I'll show you at the end how good people were at guessing, because if they can guess it, you lost your control. So I'll show you in a little bit how that went. Here are the results. There's a lot to unpack on this slide right here. What we found at 1 week, this is the difference from baseline right here, that what you see on the y-axis. So this improvement here from baseline up to here was an improvement of 8.2 words for the sham group, for the placebo group. For the anodal TDCS group, that improvement was 13.9 words. That was statistically significant. We did adjust for treatment severity, so we included that as a cofactor in our analyses. So simply looking at that, comparing the anodal compared to the placebo, there was a 70% increase in correct naming for anodal compared to sham. At 4 weeks, we had this difference here of 9.4 words on the sham and 16.8 words on the anodal TDCS. And that was statistically significant again. And then finally, for 24 weeks, which was 6 months, we still saw that treatment effect. It was still carried out, 14.9 words for the anodal TDCS and 7.1 for the sham. This is going down. This is pretty typical for long-term outcome in aphasia therapy, because some people actually get worse with regards to the treatment factor. But I was pretty encouraged that over a 6-month period of time, the treatment effects by and large were maintained. Some other relevant data. Guessing the treatment condition. The participants guessed 47.9% the correct condition. The clinicians guessed at 54%. So essentially in both groups, they were chance guessing, which suggests that they did not know what condition they were in at a given time. That's very important. Improvement on the treatment task. All but one participant improved on the treatment task. And by that I mean just greater accuracy in the last treatment session compared to the first. And the overall mean change in accuracy was about 10 percentage points. I want to show you very quickly about generalization from trained to untrained items, because this is something that we worry about a lot, that study aphasia. Are we actually seeing an improvement, not just on the trained items, but are we also seeing an improvement on the untrained items? You can think about that as an SLP working in your therapy session, let's say in outpatient therapy. You're not just interested in that person improving on the things that you're working in treatment. You want them to go beyond that, right? So that by that we mean generalization. So I'm just going to show you a couple of graphs here for the improvement on the naming 80, which is the trained items, and the improvement on the PNT. And what you see is that there's a fairly good correlation. You can count for almost 40% of the variance if you know how well they did on the trained task, you know how well the trained items, you know how well they did on the untrained items. But there's a lot of variability here. The other thing that I would point out is that a lot of people just did not show any response in either condition. You might say, well, that's not good. Well, it's not great, but this is what we see. And this is what we deal with patients with aphasia. And then, of course, you've got to decide, is this person just not a responder, or is it something that I'm doing wrong? And then we can talk about that a little bit at the end. This is for generalization at 4 weeks. Still, that correlation is, this is R squared. So this is the amount of variance, about 32%. Still fairly well correlated. And then finally, at 6 months. So that generalization pretty much kept throughout. We are accounting actually for quite a bit of the variance. Some people get worse over time. Look at this person right here. Got a lot worse at 6 months. So that's what we see. Adverse events. This was a major deal of our study because we want to know if you're actually applying electrical current through the brain, you want to make sure at the very least that you're not doing any harm. Because if you are, let's say we're causing seizures left and right, even with good treatment outcomes, this may not be viable. But the nice thing was that we had very minimal adverse events. We had some people who had a headache, some dizziness. The only major thing we had happen was this person right here who had a seizure. But that person was in the sham group. But if you look at people who are within 2 years post-stroke, the incidence of seizure in that population is about 40%. But if you look at people with larger strokes, the kinds that cause aphasia is probably higher. So we were actually quite amazed that following these patients, each one of them over 6 months at least, that we did not have more occurrences of seizures, because that's something that we see quite a bit in this population. And none of these differences were statistically significant. All right, I'm getting on the home stretch here. There was one more analysis that I wanted to show you, and I think this might be extremely important for the future. When we first submitted the grant to fund this trial, this paper had just come out in the journal Neuron, which is one of the best journals in neuroscience. And what it suggested was that the response to brain stimulation, the TDCS, is actually modulated by genotype. And what they have found is that in mice with a polymorphism of what is called the BDNF gene, the brain-derived neurotrophic factor gene, that those mice with a polymorphism of that gene did not respond to TDCS. However, mice with a normal BDNF gene showed a lot of response. And we thought at that time, well, why don't we test this in our population? So every one of our participants actually had a blood test done. And we looked at this BDNF gene to look at whether it was normal or abnormal. When I say abnormal, I'm just talking about a polymorphism of this gene. Several of us in here definitely have a polymorphism of the gene, about 30 to 40% of the population. So here are the results. The interesting thing, I think my pointer is dying here, I'm just going to show you. So this is the group that got anodal TDCS, with normal BDNF being this one and this one. And here are the people that got sham TDCS, and these are the people that had abnormal BDNF. So these are the people that had the polymorphism. If you look at this, you see that the treatment effect that we got, if this is true in a larger sample, is almost completely driven by the genotype of the subjects. If you have an abnormal BDNF gene, you are not responding to the TDCS. So you have to start out with, if you are going to be, at least based on these data, if you're going to be a good candidate, you need to start out with having a normal BDNF gene to respond to treatment. Now I gotta say, when I first got into this many years ago, I did not think I was ever going to have to think about stuff like this. But I think it's going to be something we're going to have to look at much more. The interaction was significant, which is not difficult to imagine when you look at this. The actual group differences were not huge. It was about 0.05 for the anodal TDCS, and certainly nothing in the sham TDCS group. Am I out of time? How am I on time? Okay. All right.
If you could wrap it up with
I'll wrap it up real quick. All right. So I'm just going to cruise through this. So an anodal TDCS seems to enhance the effect of aphasia therapy, at least for anomia. BDNF genotype predicts response to anodal TDCS, and we found no adverse effects associated with anodal TDCS. I think that for something like this, we probably need a larger trial to verify an effect like this, which is one of the things that we're considering in the future. There's still a lot that we don't know. I don't know if TDCS is ready for clinical use. If it becomes ready for clinical use, we would certainly have to do clinician training. So if you were going to do this, that's something else. You would probably want to take a course on this. We still need to know more about where we need to stimulate in the brain. We don't know whether we need the MRI for electrode placement, because I could see that as being a major hindrance for the application of this technology. And also, do we need the genetic testing? So that's something that I think we need to go after in the future. I was going to talk a little bit about predicting outcome of therapy, but I think I'm going to have to skip that because I just have put in a little bit too much here. Let's see. Just a couple of things. This trial was funded by the NIDCD. This was registered in clinicaltrials.gov. A couple of advertisements really quick for CSTAR, our Center for the Study of Aphasia Recovery. We have bi-monthly lectures. We have lectures every other Thursday on things related to aphasia or just normal speech and language processing. You can view those live, or you can actually go to our YouTube channel and see those lectures. We've done, I don't know, 30 or 40 of them so far. Those tend to be really well attended. People watch it online. The nice thing about watching them live is that you can ask questions at the end. This is just the website. If you want to find this, the URL is cstar.sc.edu, or you can just Google CSTAR. On this Thursday, one of my SLP postdocs is going to be talking about predictors of long-term changes in aphasia. So for people with chronic aphasia, they actually change quite a bit over time. You always used to think, oh, they're pretty stable. That's not true. If you follow people over a long period of time, some patients get a lot better, a few get worse, and some are stable. The people that are stable are actually the minority. And what she's going to talk about, her name is Alexandria, what Alexandria is going to talk about is the things that predict who is going to get better and who gets worse. An extremely important thing for clinical practice. That's going to be on 2 o'clock on Thursday. Here's our team, and I'll end on that. That's Iceland right there, which is where I'm from, and then the beach in South Carolina. Thank you.
Questions first?
I was wondering if there were any specific behavioral treatments for aphasia that you could think of that you would want to see paired with the transcranial direct stimulation, like so that it would be more translational.
Yeah, so I think that might be the next thing we need to do, is to look at just normal therapy that we would give. As far as the approach itself, so in CSTAR, which is a large treatment grant, we are comparing several different programs. We're using things like semantic feature analysis, phonomotor treatment. What we've done is that we've actually taken 3 approaches that focus on semantics, and we're comparing that to 3 approaches that focus on phonology. And at the end, what we're going to show is who responds to what kind of treatment. So right now, I would really just be speculating, but I would say the number one thing is that I want to try to simulate what a given patient would get with an SLP if they were to be treated at a local rehab facility.
Other questions?
When you look at untrained targets, are you looking at them based on like semantically related targets, phonologically related targets?
It's just correct, incorrect, and then correlating the two. So we haven't done anything with the errors so far. So I was going to talk about the prediction of outcome a little bit, but we ran out of time. So there are certain baseline factors that predict how you change. And what we're trying to predict is who responds, how do they respond with regards to the change in error types, and what is evolving. So if you're going to improve with correct naming, how are these errors evolving towards correct naming, if you will. And we're doing that with just some statistical modeling that we're trying to crunch the data on right now.
One of the inclusion criteria for somebody to be 6 months post-stroke,
Yeah.
was there a particular reason why you chose 6 months as opposed to 1 year post in terms of the spontaneous recovery that could happen then?
Yeah, so I think that probably ideally we should wait until 1 year. But when we go into a study of this size, you want to try to, I mean, I don't know how much recovery happens between 6 months and 12 months. It's probably not nearly as much as what happens between 0 and 6. But I would say that to be absolutely safe, you probably want to go to 12 to make sure that you get a stable baseline. But the nice thing about a study like this, it's randomized, so you don't know who's going to go where. But there was no difference between time post-stroke between the two groups, so the treated, so the anodal and the sham group.
Did you ever consider using time post-FA?
Yes.
Okay.
So the number of factors that we're looking at in trying to predict outcome, I mean, it's a statistical challenge because we have so many factors. We have the level of depression, we have how well you did in treatment. I mean, you name it, we assessed it. One of the things that we found so far in our larger treatment study, the C-STAR treatment study, is that the amount of exercise that patients get is a very strong predictor of outcome. And that's one of the things that we look at here as well. And if you see Alexandria's talk on Thursday, that's one of the things that you'll see is that exercise, aerobic exercise in patients is extremely important.
In your first study, was there a reason why you only looked at 1 week post and not further along?
Yeah, that's a great question. It was really for practical reasons for the poor PhD student. She wanted to graduate at some point. I mean, ideally, we probably would have gone 6 months. Yeah, I know. But I gotta say that when we got into the first study, I thought, this is not gonna work. And she really tried to talk me into letting her do this for a PhD. I always said, don't do a treatment study for your PhD, for your dissertation. It is like the last thing you should be doing. But she kept insisting, and finally I said, you know what, if you're still here 5 years from now, that's your problem. So she went with it, but she, you know, one of the things she said, okay, we're just gonna do 1 week post. And I'm like, okay, that's fine. Remember that with a lot of this stuff, some of the decisions that we make are not just based on theoretical things, but they're more practical. There are certain things we just cannot do. And that's one example of PhD students who want to graduate.
Do you think this could be used to supplement treatment of other language disorders, maybe in children as well, and to go past just aphasia?
I don't see why not. But I don't have any strong, I mean, it seems to work here. If somebody would ask me, should I use this? I would say, enter at your own risk, but there doesn't seem to be any major drawbacks to it. If you want to try this for something else, I think a lot of people have tried this for chronic conditions, and the reasons are why, because we don't have a lot of good treatment options in those cases. I mean, you see some crazy things tried for pain, for example. Well, why is that? Well, because we don't treat pain very well. So I would say, I see no reason for why we shouldn't try this on other things, but I would want to have some theoretical reasons for why you would want to do it. I mean, even though I wasn't completely sold on this idea in the beginning. We did have some rationale behind doing it. Increase in activation seems to be associated with good treatment outcomes. That seems to be fairly good reason for me to do it. And also with chronic patients, if you truly could translate these effects into aphasia, into the clinic, it could have huge differences. So I would say, try it with other things, but be careful. In the back.
Do you have any guesses about why the BDNF polymorphism influences response to treatment?
Yeah, so brain-derived neurotrophic factor is essential for all plastic changes. So you can see that there's in animal models that whenever, for example, if you're having an animal do a motor task, there's or learning a motor task, there is an increase in BDNF secretion in the motor cortex. It is very important for learning new things. The polymorphism itself, it certainly doesn't prevent somebody completely from learning, but the learning is enhanced with a normal BDNF gene compared to an abnormal BDNF gene. Why that interacts with the TDCS, I don't know.
So is it something that predicts in general recovery from stroke?
You know what? Yeah, that's a great question. So that's what I expected. So I expected that normal BDNF, even in the placebo group, that those patients would be better than those who had sham and abnormal BDNF, but we did not see that. I would just have expected greater difference in the anodal group, but we did not see that, and that was surprising.
So to follow up on that one more time, that was exactly my question. So you showed change over the course of treatment. Do you see any difference at baseline between BDF normal versus abnormal variants?
I haven't looked at that. No,
Okay.
no.
So maybe some
Yeah.
recovery has happened just
Yeah.
from the natural course.
No, but then the algorithm that was putting people into different groups would have taken care of it.
Okay, thanks.
All right, thank you.